Jack Carr, thanks so much for being here with us at the Cipher Brief. It's a pleasure to chat with you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
You've kind of really had an amazing career in your own right. You spent more than 20 years in the Navy and Navy Special Warfare, which is sort of like the elite of the Navy. Not sort of, it is. And then you really transitioned into becoming a writer. I really want to kind of know your story. Where was your original passion in life, and did it change, or have you always had a passion for doing two things?
Well, I always had that passion for doing two things. I don't know why it didn't shift. I think it's because I wanted to do them so early, and then never got dissuaded along the path, or I didn't let people dissuade me, I guess is the better way to put it. And just to be clear, it was 20 years and a wake up. So it was 20 years exactly, not 1 second more. But yeah, ever since I was a little kid, I think just serving in the military was in my blood from an early age. It was just there. I listened to that calling very early. My grandfather was killed in World War II. He was a Corsair pilot, which is the plane that has the gull wings that folded up so you can fit them on aircraft carriers. So I was watching Black Sheep Squadron about Pappy Boynton, starring Robert Conrad, with my dad back in the early 80s when it was in syndication. It came out in the late 70s. But that was our connection really to that generation without a Facebook and internet and social media and those sorts of things. So I think that service was just in there from an early age. And then I found out about what SEALs were at age 7, so second grade. And my mom was a librarian, so we went down to the local library to do some research after I heard about the Frogmen through a movie called The Frogmen. And back then, of course, you could find the end of the internet by getting to the last magazine article or book with a chapter on SEALs. And back then, there was just a couple really on what SEALs had done in Vietnam. There wasn't really much else. And then over the years, starting in really the early 90s, then we started to get books by SEALs about their experiences in Vietnam. In the 80s, there were a few, even in the 70s, there were some from Army Special Forces guys. 5 Years to Freedom by Nick Rowe. There was a few other ones out there in the 80s. So I was just collecting as many of those books as I could because I grew up surrounded by books and this love of reading. And about 5th grade is when I started to read or transition from the young adult fiction, like the Farley Mowats and My Sides of the Mountain, that sort of a thing, and then move into the adult fiction, the same sort of things my parents were reading. And certainly by 6th grade, I was reading those kind of books. And that's when Rambo First Blood Part 2 comes out. Of course, we have movies like Uncommon Valor and Red Dawn and Missing in Action and Commando and Predator, and like all these movies that were very influential on me as a kid. But I started reading the same kind of thrillers that my parents were. So Tom Clancy, reading Hunt for Red October in the early days, probably when I understood about half of the technical jargon in there. But I'm reading Tom Clancy and Nelson DeMille and A.J. Quinnell and Jason Pollock and Mark Olden and Louis L'Amour and David Morrell, who created Rambo with First Blood back in 1972. And then in the mid 80s, he had a trilogy that started with The Brotherhood of the Rose that was incredible. So I just started reading those books. And a lot of that, I think, was because the protagonists in those books in the 80s had backgrounds that I wanted in real life. So they were either SEALs in Vietnam, they were Army Special Forces in Vietnam, they were Marine snipers in Vietnam, they were CIA paramilitary in Vietnam. And now as contemporary thrillers in the 80s and 90s, they were using those skills as whatever they were now, as a CIA paramilitary officer, or a stuntman, or a private investigator, or a police officer, whatever they were in the book that I was reading. So I just knew that one day after my time in the military that I'd write those types of thrillers. It was just very clear to me. And even in 6th grade, I read in class, we read The Most Dangerous Game, which is essentially a short story written in 1924 by Richard Connell. And I told myself in 6th grade that one day I would write a thriller that paid tribute to that short story. And that was my 3rd novel, Savage Son. So I knew I wanted to be a SEAL from a very early age, so 7, and then certainly wanted to be a writer, a novelist by 6th grade, which was age 11. So I just stayed on those paths, and I didn't realize how much they would complement one another. I thought of them back then as two distinctly different professions, and I always thought of them as professions, not a career or a job or work. It never entered my mind that they were those things. They were just the path that I was called. too, and I just never stopped listening to that. Never got dissuaded by people who can dissuade you very easily with a look, like asking you questions like, do you know how hard it is to be a SEAL, or do you know how tough it is to get anything published or to make the New York Times list? And I just never, like, if anything, I used those things as fuel and didn't let them take up bandwidth or take anything away from either my training to be a SEAL, whether that was physical or it was diving into books about military history and warfare and tactics and strategy, or it was the writing as I started to get out. So that's that's the long and the short of it. I figured that was the long of it. I'm sorry, it was a lot of talking.
No, I'm sure you're quite familiar with the man in the arena speech, because it sounds like, you've had to overcome a lot of critics, as most people do in their lives, despite what they choose to do as a profession. And I love the message there. I think that's a strong leadership message as well, to turn that into fuel. And I'm assuming that's kind of what you did with a lot of your books. You ventured out, like, you've got this great series on Amazon about your main character, James Reese, who you've started with. You probably have a real love affair for this guy who you've created, who does straddle this world of, being a Navy SEAL, having gone through a lot of hardship. I think most people know the story now, but he's out for revenge. Chris Pratt plays the character on Amazon. Did you ever think that something like that would happen? And was that one of the, I guess, sort of measurements of success for you when you started out? Like, wow, I've kind of hit what I wanted to hit here. No pun intended, because you were also a sniper.
This is true. And speaking of the man in the arena speech, I had that in the early days of my time in the SEAL team. So 1997, I got to my first SEAL team. And I printed out that speech, put a picture of a SEAL emerging from the water that was a sketch. I forget where the sketch came from exactly, but I paired those two together, printed them on a regular printer, and then laminated them with, like, lamination stuff from Staples or Office. And I put it on my refrigerator when I was a new guy in the SEAL teams. But going back to the question, yes, for whatever reason, same thing. As a kid, you're reading a book by, let's see, David Morrell, and you're looking at that cover and it says New York Times best-selling author of First Blood, or something like that. Or you're reading, same thing with Nelson DeMille or Tom Clancy, and you're seeing things that say, #1 New York Times best-selling author of Hunt for Red October, and then Hunt for Red October is coming out as a movie, or something along those lines. And so that was just always in my head. That was the path. Sure, you write a book, it hits the New York Times list, you turn it into a movie. Later, as I got closer to getting out, then streaming series and things became quite popular. So it was either a movie or a streaming series on one of the streaming services. But for me, that was just the path, just like going into the SEAL teams. You go into the Navy, you try out for the SEAL teams, you go to BUDS, you make it through Hell Week, you finish BUDS, you get to your SEAL team, you go through SEAL tactical training, you go on your first platoon, you're on probation, then you come back and you get your Trident. Like, that was just the path. I wasn't really focused on the 80% that didn't make it. I was always focused on the 20% that made it, or being part of that 20%. That was just my natural assumption, that I'm going to be in there, but not without putting in the work. I was certainly, if I wasn't going to make it, it wasn't going to be because I didn't put in the work. And so I always just thought about that. I was always going to be as prepared as I possibly could by reading and having this foundation as a student, really, of warfare and leadership. And then same thing with writing. If it didn't make it, if I didn't get published, if it didn't make it on the New York Times list, didn't get turned into a series, it wasn't going to be because I didn't put in the work, because I thought it wasn't going to be because I thought, oh, no one's going to like this, or, oh, this isn't any good, or anything along those lines. I was going to get it as good as I could possibly make it and not leave anything on the field. And so if it didn't make it, then it wasn't because of something that I left on the field, something that I didn't do. I was all in on it. So as I started writing it in December of 2014, so I got out in June of 2016. So during my last couple of year and a half, I guess, I dropped my papers to get out. And for those that are listening or watching who have done the same thing, you know that then you go in a different pile, essentially. And your job is to get out of this gigantic bureaucracy called the military, and you go to medical, and you go to dental, and you go to the transition assistance program, whatever useless thing that was. And you go get read out of secret programs, and you turn in gear, and you sign a bunch of papers. But before you do all that, you stand in line to make your appointments for all those things. So it just takes, because it's very inefficient, and meaning I have time. And with that time, I'm going to write because I know exactly what I'm going to do next. So December of 2014, I started writing the first words. And for whatever reason, I just knew that this would turn into a New York Times bestseller and it would get picked up and it would be a movie. But I had no connections to publishing, no connections to Hollywood, no idea how that happened. I didn't even know I needed an agent. I didn't even know anything on that. I just knew that I had read so much throughout my life that I had built this foundation, not because I wasn't doing the reading throughout my whole life because I wanted to build that. It was just the magic in those pages. I just loved reading and I knew I would write later. It wasn't Machiavellian in the sense that I'm going to read this book at age 11, 12, 13. And when I get to age 40, I will start writing my books and I will pattern it off what I'm learning now. No, it wasn't like that at all. It was just me being essentially seen, not heard as a child, where I don't have a mortgage, I don't have a car payment, I don't have a job to go to. My only job is to really just go to school and not be a nuisance, essentially. So reading was just very natural for me. It was as natural as doing anything else. And I loved getting lost in the magic of those pages. But looking back, that really allowed me the foundation to do what I'm doing now. Meaning in 1986, 87, 88, I'm reading books that are contemporary thrillers at the time. Looking back, of course, they're not. So that's a different reading experience than someone, let's say I woke up at age 40 and decided I wanted to be an author and thought, oh, what should I have been reading for the last 30 years? Let me go back and read these contemporary thrillers from the 80s. But guess what? Now I have a job. Now I have kids. Now I have a car payment. Now I have a mortgage. I have responsibilities. And that's a different reading experience, putting yourself back in the shoes of someone in the mid 80s in order to why isn't this person just jumping on the internet? Oh, yeah, that's right, because there is no internet. Okay, great. He's searching for a quarter. Why? Oh, because he needs a quarter to make a phone call. Okay, got it. What's a carburetor? Like all these things that you have to think about today. It's just a different reading experience, I think. So I was very fortunate that my family was a family of readers, and that was passed on to me. And I got to read all those things as contemporary thrillers during their times in the 80s and 90s to build this foundation. But that never stopped. So I just always knew that as I started writing, I thought, who should play that main character? Like my first sentence. And I thought, oh, there's this Chris Pratt guy. I saw him on Parks and Rec. And I just saw him in Zero Dark 30 at playing a Navy SEAL. He seems like he needs to do something for his career that will show that he has some range. He'd be perfect because I don't want someone who's done this before. And so I'm already thinking that way. And this is one sentence in with no connections anywhere. But I picked Chris Pratt back then. And then about, how many years later is that? 5 years later or so, I get a call from a SEAL buddy of mine, Jared Shaw, and he calls me in November of 2017. So the book is now at Simon & Schuster, have a publication date of March 2018. So it's a few months before it comes out. And he calls me and says, hey, first he says, do you remember me? And I said, of course, I remember you, Jared. How's it going? And he said, but you remember what you did for me in the SEAL teams? And I said, no. And he said, you're the only person when I said I was getting out, you took me into your office, sat me down, talked to me about transitioning. You introduced me to people in the private sector. And then you followed up with me to ask how things were going. And no one else did that. And I always wanted to say thank you. And I said, yeah, no problem. How's it going? And he said, it's going great, but I heard you wrote a book. And I said, yeah, I have a book coming out. I have a galley copy, which is like an early thing for reviewers. And I can send you one of those if you want. And he said, yeah, I'd like to take a look at it, but I'd like to give it to a friend of mine. And I said, yeah, no problem. Who's that? And he said, Chris Pratt. And I was like, that's very convenient for me because that's what I want to play.
Did he know that you had thought about Chris Pratt in this way for this character? Is this completely just coincidence?
Complete out of the blue coincidence.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Crazy. And I wanted Antoine Fuqua to direct. And another friend a few months later gave Antoine a copy at like a speaking event in LA, and he read it and then he wanted it at the same time. So I got the director that I wanted and the star that I wanted, and they had worked together on Magnificent Seven. So they both wanted it at the same time. So they called each other and said, hey, let's do this all together. And now we're all dear friends and executive producers on this. And Jared's writing on it. He's an executive producer on it, and he's in it as playing a SEAL boozer. And it's just, couldn't have worked out better. So I'm very, very thankful.
It is really unbelievable, just all the things that sort of really fell into place or seemed to fall into place. I mean, there's a lot of hard work that gets you to a point where anything in your life can fall into place, but that's pretty amazing, I have to
Yeah.
say.
Yeah, the
I
foundational product always has to be the best that it can possibly be in any business. So that foundational product has to be there. It has to be the best it can possibly be. But then it's the supporting efforts, for use some military terms, supporting efforts to the main effort that allows you to get that product out there. I equate it to, and I didn't think about this until maybe a month before the book came out in 2018, because I have no background in business, no background in marketing, no background in anything like that. Never had a social media account, didn't want one. Very private by nature. And part of the allure of being an author is that I thought back in the 80s that I could go live in a cabin in the mountains, write a book, send it to New York, maybe do one interview on like CBS This Morning or something, and then you go back to writing your book. That was what I thought. And I thought that, I held on to that up until about a month or two before the book came out. And then I realized that this is not the 20th century. This is not 1985, 1995, even 2005. This is 2018. Things are a little different right now, unless you're a complete outlier, let's say with 50 Shades of Grey or a Twilight or something like that. And you're going to have to do all those things that any business needs to do in order to let people know that you exist amongst all of these distractions that are out there. So you're no different than any other business that has a product. So I realized that. And then I looked at the space the same way I looked at the battlefield in Iraq and Afghanistan, which was, how is the enemy going to adapt to me? How do I adapt to that enemy? How do I anticipate their anticipation of me to stay a step ahead? Or how do I capitalize on momentum? How do I look for gaps in the enemy's defenses and then exploit those? And so I looked at publishing the same way. And I think it was beneficial for me to do that because I didn't have any baggage from, say, oh, when I worked at Google or when I was at Amazon or anything like that, this is what you do. Or I had none of that. It was just me looking at something without many filters in place from past jobs, because I didn't have any past jobs. And so I thought, okay, well, what are my supporting efforts to the main effort then? What can I do today that an author couldn't have done in the 70s, 80s, 90s, early 2000s that allows me to let people know that I exist? How do I add value to their lives along the way? How do I engage with them amongst all this clutter when we're carrying these things, these devices around that are essentially, that are designed to distract us and keep you from doing what I want people to do, which is to dive into a book without distractions. So how do I use those platforms in a way to add value to people's lives throughout the year, so that when the book comes out, then they will put that phone aside and they'll listen or read this book. So it was just kind of looking at things with that in mind, and then putting essentially a strategy in place. But that part was all me, and now finally I have a couple people to help with some of those things. Now that there are multiple projects, multiple TV shows, the nonfiction books, the thrillers, and a bunch of other projects that haven't even been announced yet. So it's a lot to juggle. So put a team together, an e-commerce person, a chief of staff, someone that can help with social
Now
media.
you're an empire.
Sort of thing. Well, I don't know about that, but I just need to I realize that it's time to put some structures and processes in place so that I can do what I need to do, which is write. So I'm at that stage. I kind of equate it to someone who starts a computer company in 1977 and has to do all those things because they're working out of their garage. They have to let people know that their product is a computer, and this is why you need one, and this is why yours is the best, and it has to be the best. And then you have to use whatever tools are available at the time to allow you to get that message out. And you have to be the CEO, the CFO, the CMO. If there was social media back then, you would be the social media manager and the project developer. You have to be all of these things as an entrepreneur. So I think that I'm a good entrepreneur just because I've learned how to adapt just in life in general. But then I also think that once you get to a certain stage, let's say you're the computer guy in 1977, but now it's 1983, and you've been running by yourself essentially for these years, and now people do know about computers, that do want one, and do have a couple choices, and you've begun to expand where you can't continue to put these things together in your garage. And now you need some people to help put these things together. You have to work with someone maybe to design a strategy, or you lead that strategy and bring people in that can design a commercial that can run during the Super Bowl, like with the Mac back in the day. So all of those things are necessary for any business as it grows and scales.
It's unbelievable. I feel like I've just gone through almost like an MBA and sort of leadership, and because you touched on so many things that people sometimes find themselves in the midst of in their lives, but they don't know what it is. They're like, I have a great idea, but I don't know what to do next. And obviously, you're a very strategic thinker. You've done something just recently. I want to ask you about. You've changed from doing what's really been a very successful series of 7 novels to writing something that is nonfiction, with a co-author that you have, but it's called Targeted Beirut, and you're telling the real story of the 1983 Marine barracks bombing, of course, which I think most people with your background, everybody knows about this. I wonder why the shift, and how are you thinking about using your voice, which you've really established as a successful fiction writer, now by telling nonfiction stories? What are you looking to do there?
Yeah, so it's just once again looking at publishing in general as the way I looked at the battlefield, and also being essentially a student, even though I didn't look at it that way at the time. But I was very aware that Tom Clancy had flagship novels throughout the '80s, most with Jack Ryan, not Red Storm Rising, but starting with starting with Hunt for October. Then we have Red Storm Rising. Then we have Patriot Games. Then Cardinal of the Kremlin. Then Clear and Present Danger. And then Tom Clancy branches out in the early '90s after Hunt for October movie comes out. And then we start seeing some nonfiction. We get a book called Submarine comes out first, and then he'll branch off into essentially 2 different nonfiction series, one called the Guided Tour series, of which Submarine was one, and then Study and Command series is the other. And then he worked, and he did those with co-authors. So I was very cognizant of that model now looking back, but from the fan perspective, I was aware of it at the time just as a reader. And also I weave a lot of history into my novels as it is, into my thrillers. If people follow me on social media, they know that I weave a lot of history into my social media posts, particularly about terrorism, because growing up in the '80s, I just knew from an early age that my generation's war would have a connection to terrorism. I remember the 1979 Iran hostage crisis very vividly. Those are some of my earliest memories of Walter Cronkite counting down those days on the news. Very aware of the 1983 Beirut barracks bombing. That Time and the Newsweek covers. Those are the 2 magazines that we got at our house, along with our local paper, along with Wall Street Journal and New York Times. So I remember those coming across the dining room table. I'd get them after my parents finished reading them in the mornings anyway for the newspaper. The magazines I get in the mailbox first before they did. But I was very aware of those things back in the day, and I always wondered, like, why we're the United States. How is this happening, and why are we not retaliating for these things? Why we have American hostages that are now in captivity over a year in this place called Iran over there? So those things were very impactful to me during my adolescence, during my formative years. So when I thought I built up enough political capital with Simon & Schuster to be able to pitch another idea, I did so right away. And I pitched a series called Targeted that would focus on different terrorist events that really impacted our foreign policy, changed the course of history in many cases. And I wanted to humanize those events, because a lot of times you hear this number like 241 servicemen killed. That's a big number, but you don't really know their names. You don't know their backstories. You don't know that they had wives and children. They had mothers, they had fathers. Why were they over there in the first place? What lessons can we learn from that so that it doesn't happen again? We're not very good in this country at learning from lessons of the past and applying those lessons to present problem sets as wisdom. So the least that I can do as an author and a student of warfare and a student of history is to capture some of those lessons. So Simon & Schuster was 100% on board. And I also knew I didn't want it to be pop history. I didn't want it to be me reading or rereading a bunch of books on terrorism, the Middle East, regurgitating those essentially, and then applying some sort of analysis to it at the end. I wanted it to be a real work of history. And in order to do that, I wanted to work with someone who actually knew what they're doing in the nonfiction space. And there's only one person I wanted to work with, James Scott. I had all 5 of his books already. He has 4 on World War II, 1 on the USS Liberty. And I just loved the work. And I didn't even, looking back, I was just so busy at the time. I should have at least looked at one, let's say, YouTube video of him in an interview, just to make sure he wasn't a crazy person. But I didn't even do that. I just loved the work. And I said, there's one person I want to work with, James Scott. And I was on the phone with my agent and publisher. And they said, well, who's his agent? And I just had the book right there. And I went to the acknowledgments of the author's note. And I said, well, he's thanking some guy in here named John Glussman. And my publisher, Emily Bessler, starts laughing. And she says, that's my husband. And so they connected us, and we hit it off immediately. He was amazing, and I learned so much. I approach everything as a student. I did in the military, I do now, and I learned so much about research, going into archives, correctly annotating things in the notes section, and we really made this a work of history, and got to meet so many amazing people along the way. And although I knew this from my own experience and knew this just from reading and just from applying common sense, but when you talk to so many family members who lost loved ones in that attack, you really realize how much of a multi-generational impact strategic level decisions have down here at the tactical level. It's not just the people that didn't come home. It's those people who were digging through the rubble for their buddies with their bare hands, K-bar knives, maybe a shovel, maybe a crowbar if they could find one, and how that impacts them, which in turn impacts their families. So multi-generational there. And then, of course, the empty seats at the dinner table for the 241 servicemen who did not come home. And that just needs to be hammered home to those senior level military leaders, elected representatives, bureaucrats that are making these decisions to put U.S. boots on the ground overseas, especially in tactically disadvantageous positions like they did to the Marines in Beirut, and once again that they did in August of 2021 in Afghanistan. So the lessons are out there. The lessons are in the pages of history.
They are. So I have to ask you where you get your ideas from. I mean, obviously, you just have this fountain of creativity that apparently probably never sleeps, I guess. But your latest book, Red Sky Morning, you're talking about a rising Silicon Valley tech mogul with unknown allegiances at the forefront of a revolution in quantum computing and artificial intelligence. I have no idea where you got that from. And then a politician controlled by a foreign power is a breath away from the Oval Office. No idea where you got that one from. I think the magic in your books, though, is like you pick up on these themes that are happening in the real world, and then you sort of layer on what ifs, right? Is that sort of your approach, or am I off base?
No, that's a very good way to put it. Unfortunately, the world keeps giving me a lot to work with, and I don't see that stopping anytime soon. And actually, right before this, I had an idea for a trilogy, and I was like, oh, I got to jump on this interview, but as soon as I'm over, I'm going to jump over and write that down before I forget. So I had this, I don't know why they come to me. They come to me essentially when it's quiet. When I'm not, I have a wife, 3 children, a dog, people coming in for Thanksgiving, like it's chaos here constantly. But when I have these moments of quiet, then that's when they just seem to come to me, and they never stop. But this was a really good one, and I'm gonna write it down as soon as we're done. But I
want to remember this so that whenever this one becomes great, we get to do the first interview with you.
Perfect. And for this one, I introduced a character named Alice, and she's an artificially intelligent quantum computer. I introduced her in 2022. Yep. So I started writing it then in 2021. But that was before ChatGPT became part of the lexicon.
Which changed everything.
And so the book comes out. There's this AI computer that's attached to the military and intelligence apparatus. And the way I got to that was, I forget what initially sparked the idea. Usually it's a conversation when it's something like that that's super outside my wheelhouse, that I haven't been reading about or hasn't been mentioned in an article. I think this one came from a conversation, as did the book before, The Devil's Hand, about a bioweapon attack. Came from just a spark, just a one, and that one came from a conversation with someone in Argentina who was in charge of airline security right before 9/11, and it was just a one sentence thing that he said to me down in Argentina, and I thought, interesting. And then years later, it became really the basis for The Devil's Hand, which is book 4. But in doing research on something a bioweapon. I had no idea about anything. All I know about bioweapons is really what I've seen in Hollywood films, and then in a few like other books, like The Hot Zone, Richard Preston, that I read that back in the 90s. So it really comes from popular culture, a lot of it. But in this case, I don't want my interpretation of what I'm writing about in my book to come from popular culture. I want it to be based in reality. So really that's just the kickoff point. And then luckily I know enough people who know enough people to introduce me, make introductions so I can essentially become a journalist and start asking questions. And in the case of bioweapons, in the case of this artificially intelligent quantum computer, in the case of finance 2 books ago, oh my gosh, my head is still exploding from the research I had to do into the world of finance back in the Dead. Then I try to do as much research as I can just on my own. Books are pretty much outdated when you're talking about AI and quantum computing right away, but I still get a baseline so I understand the history. And then you're reading journals and articles in order to try to get as current as you can. And then you have these interviews set up with people who maybe want to help or maybe had some touch point with the government or intelligence services and quantum computing or the private sector, quantum computing and AI as well. And so at least when you start talking to them, they know that you did as much research as you possibly could, essentially starting from nothing, so that you're not wasting their time. And so that helps right off the bat. And then if they were attached to, let's say, some sort of a secret program, they talk around it and they'll drop a hint maybe. And this is where the journalism hat comes in. And so they're very careful not to do anything that gives away a secret. But as a journalist then, and I don't think of myself as a journalist, I'm just playing one. And so then I put it essentially on a board. And you have all the research that you've done, and then you have what you think might be possible or what might be happening, and then you have all these interviews, and you start to fill in the blanks on that mosaic. And each person that you talk to gives you a little hint of something different, which helps you fill in that broader mosaic. And so that's been the case for all the research that I've done about military intelligence, quantum computing, that sort of thing. Because in the military, all I really did was kick in doors in the middle. Anything that any big city SWAT team is going to do tonight, that's essentially what I did in the military. People think that SEALs know all sorts of secret things and all that. Maybe some do, but I sure didn't. It was all target packages, pattern of life, triggers, heading out, kicking in those doors, grabbing somebody out of bed in the middle of the night, bringing them back for questioning, trying to do follow-on targets. Just the same thing that's going to happen, like I said, with every big city police department tonight, or marshal service, or serving warrants, that sort of a thing. So anything in the secret realm with bioweapons and nuclear codes and plans and none of that stuff ever came across my radar in the military. So it's all what I've learned post-military from just doing my own investigations.
Yeah. It's pretty amazing. I would think, though, that while you were kicking in doors and carrying out operations in the middle of the night, like you mentioned, there must have been some part of you at the end of an operation when you were kind of coming down from the adrenaline that was like, wow, no one would really believe this happened or that happened, or if only the world understood how it should really happen. How like involved are you in making sure that some of the things that are in the show now that's based on your books are sort of reflective of reality, and how sort of cognitively aware, I guess, is a little bit of a cerebral question, but are you that people who watch your shows may often think this is actually real? They know it's Hollywood, but do you ever think about that sort of balance when you're writing or now working on, the TV shows that you are associated with?
Oh yeah, for the TV show, it is at the forefront of all we do. Meaning we want someone who served in uniform, or a police officer, a firefighter, EMS, someone who's essentially out there on the front line. We want them, when they sit down on the couch at the end of the day and maybe crack a beer open and turn this thing on, we want them to know that we at least put in the work to get it right. Now, this is Hollywood and we're telling a story, and you have, 57 minutes to do that in each episode. And you have to have a story arc within each episode and an overarching story arc throughout the course of a season. So there are certain parameters, obviously, there, time being one, budget being another. So there are all sorts of factors that I don't think most people realize when they sit down to watch a show. Or certainly critics that tear shows apart don't really think about or care about, because I know how much work goes into these things now. So even if something is objectively terrible, a lot of work still went into that. And so when we do anything in the show, we have this 80-20 rule, and that's at 80% authenticity and 20% Hollywood hot sauce. And so that's kind of the mixture that we have. And like, oh, geez, this isn't really, this falls in our 20% here of the Hollywood hot sauce. And that's just how it's going to be. But other things that we can keep authentic and real, we want people to know that we at least put in as much effort as we possibly could, so that it would resonate with them. So we're at least exploring the mindset of a modern day warrior, but still telling a story at the same time. So that's how we approach it. And then in the books, when I started, I didn't think it was going to be as personal of a writing experience as it ended up. All the way through, and my process has been the same the whole time, having a title first, because I don't like worrying about a title or wasting bandwidth on a title. I've had good titles thus far, and I just don't like to write while I'm worried about finding another good title. So it's a title, it's a theme, usually a 1-sentence, maybe a 2-sentence theme. In the case of the Terminal List, it was a 2-word theme, or no, Revenge Without Constraint, 3-word theme. And each book has had its own theme to guide the writing process. I find that very helpful. Each book having a different theme that guides me directly or indirectly back to the theme. Then I write a 1-page executive summary, which ends up being maybe 2 paragraphs, maybe 4, so maybe it's a page and a half, maybe it's half a page, but it's essentially a letter to myself. And I read it and I think, is this worth the next year and a half of my life? And if the answer is yes, then I read it again and I say, if someone was to walk by a Hudson News in the airport and were to pull this book off the shelf and read the flap jacket or turn the paper back over and read this or some variation of this, would they be willing to invest time? Is this interesting enough to them to invest time in, time they're never going to get back? And if the answer is yes, or probably, then that's my next book. And I turn that 1-page executive summary into an outline, and then I turn that outline into the narrative. But when I started, I thought I knew at least that I would get the sniper weapon stuff right. I would get some of those things right. And if I didn't know something about an aircraft or a submarine or something like that, I at least knew people or knew people who could put me in touch with them, so I could either have them check my work to make sure that if someone, let's say a submariner is reading something about a submarine, or a pilot is reading something about an aircraft or whatever, that at least they'll know that I put in the work to try to get that stuff right. So I knew I'd do that as I started writing. But even through all that process up until turning the outline into the narrative, then as soon as I started writing the first words, I realized that this is going to be a much more personal writing experience than I anticipated. And they've all been that way thus far. And not in a way that I take something that happened in real life and then I just turn it into a fictional narrative or part of the story or a chapter. It's more the feelings and emotions behind certain things, so that if my protagonist gets ambushed on the streets of Los Angeles, California, then I go back and remember what it was like to get ambushed in Baghdad in 2006, and I take those feelings and emotions and I apply them to the fictional narrative. Same thing with the sniper stuff. I don't have to go find a sniper from Ramadi at the height of the war and interview them and have those answers get filtered through whatever preconceived notions I may have, other books that I've read, documentaries I've watched, movies I've seen. No, there's zero of that. It all comes from my heart and soul directly onto the page. And I think that resonates when people read it. They know that these feelings and emotions aren't coming from Hollywood, or not coming from just a stereotypical kind of veteran character that someone's made up that has no experience in Iraq and Afghanistan, that they're really coming from me, my heart and soul. And then also my character's on a journey. And I think that also, I didn't think about it at the time, but I think those feelings and emotions, plus my character not being the same person just dropped into it. And now he saves the world from a nuclear, now he saves it from bioweapons. Now he's evolving over time. And just like all of us are, we're all on this journey called life. And hopefully we're taking the lessons of the past and learning from them and applying them to present problem sets, whether it's personal or professional. But my character is doing the same thing. And a lot of times I don't think that you really get that in a lot of other series characters. But I think that's made it resonate with people because that's one thing we all have in common, no matter what country you are in, no matter where in the world you are. You're on a journey. And all of us are, as is my character. So I think that those two things really helped. And they weren't at the outset, they weren't part of a grand strategy. They just came about naturally.
Yeah. A couple of things I want to get in here because I could talk to you literally, I think, all day. There's so many fascinating aspects. I mean, going back to like your childhood, which I love, and the fact that, those boring moments were actually sort of little incubators of creativity and thought. And I worry sometimes about today's kids because they never have a moment where they're bored and can do the creative things that you've done. But I also want to talk about what's coming next, because besides kind of branching into this targeted series that you've launched, which is nonfiction, you've announced on your website that the next book, Cry Havoc, is a little bit of a different character. Now, my dad, of course, everyone likes to share their connection to service and the country and patriotism. My dad, who grew up in Southern California at the age of, I think, 17, before he was legally allowed to, signed up to become a Marine and was one of the first folks, who went to fight the war in Vietnam, a very unpopular war. Why did you choose to go back to Vietnam for your next thriller series?
Well, I always had this idea. This was strategic from the beginning, and that was to create multi-generational characters that were interesting and that people wanted to know more about. And so from the first book all the way through, I have essentially two families, the Hastings family on one side, the Reese family on the other, where I have at least 3 generations of possibilities to explore in story. And it was really important for me to create those characters as interesting characters early on so that people would want more, would ask about it. Hey, are you going to do this? I want to hear more about the Hastings family. I want to hear more about the Reese family. So that was very intentional. I think I got a lot of that from Stephen Hunter, who wrote Point of Impact, and amazing story. They turned it into the movie Shooter with Mark Wahlberg, directed by Antoine Fuqua, which movie I love, by the way, but the book is incredible. And he's a Marine sniper from Vietnam, and it's a series, but also Stephen Hunter goes back and does his father and grandfather. So I think that was a big influence on me. But there was just, once again, I didn't just start doing that at age 40 when I started writing. It was, no, that's already a part of my experience because they were a part of me as I read them as contemporary thrillers growing up. And Stephen Hunter is just an amazing author. Great guy too. Now we're friends. But so that was very intentional. And I just knew I would do it at some point. It was just a question of when. And then once again, it became very natural after Red Sky Morning to leave it up in the air. Like, is this the end of the James Reese story? Maybe not, probably not. But now it's a very natural time to go and explore his dad and his dad's journey from the SEAL teams in Vietnam into the CIA. So I've been dropping hints, and he's been a part of the storylines in some of the books, and now it's time to explore his story. Also, it is exhausting as you write a contemporary thriller today in the espionage type space to think about, everyone has a cell phone. Oh, there's a GPS in every phone. Oh, there's a GPS in most vehicles. Oh, there are cameras everywhere. Oh, there are satellites everywhere. Oh, everything is every email, every correspondence, every text message is essentially collected, whether it's by private entities or by the NSA or some partnership.
Facial recognition. Yep.
Facial recognition. So how do you do a forged passport in 2024? That sort of a thing. So going back to 1968, which is where I set this next novel, I don't have to think about a lot of those things. In fact, I get to go back and think about old school tradecraft and finding forgers and people looking for not even a quarter. I have to go back and research, like, how much was a payphone back then? I don't know, but I will research it as someone does that in this book. Cars that can be hot wired or whatever, that don't have a GPS tracking device in them, or whatever it's called, LoJack, whatever it is called. So all of those things, I don't have to consider in every single chapter like you do in a thriller today that's contemporary. So I get to go back to the 60s, which is awesome. So I love that piece of it. So that was very attractive to me as well, and an incentive to go back and do that. So that's what I'm in the middle of right now, and I'm so excited about it. It's awesome.
I want to go back to something you talked about early on, and you've talked about how your characters evolve and how you evolve over time. This is a time of year in particular that's very, very difficult for veterans, as you know, who are looking to sort of take the skills that they've acquired in the military, whether it's 2 years or 20, and figure out how they fit back into society. Like, how do those skills transfer into something that's going to have 1/10 of the sort of satisfaction of the job that they've had in the prior years while serving? It's a really difficult time. Suicide levels are really high. It's the holidays. I wonder, like, how much you think about the transition process. You've had such a huge success with it, but not everybody does. Do you have messages, Jack, or do you spend time with other veterans who are kind of struggling through this? And do you have any thoughts for ways that people can sort of find their strengths? Because I feel like you've addressed a whole lot of things in our conversation today, which are very strategic and leadership focused, and tell people how to find the strengths you have and how not to give up and how to know that you do have a community. How do you think about all this?
Yeah, no, it's tough. And I think one thing that helped me is that as I got out, I was over at Buds, which is our SEAL training facility, and I was the operations officer then, which also meant that I did not have much to do. I didn't have the weight on my shoulders of taking a platoon or a troop downrange. That part of my life was over. I knew I was gonna get out, so I got to I got to take a breath, look around, and make some decisions about next steps. As I did that, I saw how many, and I'll just talk about my experience because I don't know what other people's are, but in the SEAL teams, I saw how hard it was for people to leave that life behind. The operations officer, I'd get calls from people, I won't say daily, but probably weekly, certainly every couple of weeks, of someone who had gotten out that wants to take their new boss on a tour of Buds, or something along those lines. And even though I wasn't supposed to, I always hook those guys up. Just pick the time when, let's say, I've had a commanding officer who wasn't into that, I would just schedule it a time for when he was gone, because I was just always want to help people no matter what. Just I can't change that about myself, no matter what someone above me tells me to do. So
Don't follow every rule.
I have a little, yeah, there might be a little rebellious streak that people probably sense in my novels, or interviews. And that's just always been a part of me. So I'm not going to change to conform, even though you're supposed to conform in the military. What's great about special operations in general is that it's very creative, meaning that even though back in garrison, you're supposed to kind of get stamped back into, with your haircuts and uniforms and relations and all that stuff. Downrange, you cannot, because the enemy is not. They're adapting. You need to adapt. You need to be an aggressive problem solver, a creative aggressive problem solver on that battlefield, especially if you're a leader and people to your right and left, the decisions that you make are going to impact them and their families for generations, essentially. So anyway, rebellious streak. When you get back to garrison, that's why I think so many guys in special operations get in trouble back stateside, just because they're then supposed to conform immediately back into the perfect sailor or whatever when you're back in garrison, and it doesn't quite work like that, no matter how much senior level leadership tell you to make it so. So I always try to help people out, but in the process of doing that, I got to see a lot of guys have a hard time leaving this life behind. And I got to see a lot of people who got out but stayed in the same place and would come to Buds and wanted to give people tours and would go to the same grocery stores, the same bars, the same schools. They're dropping kids off at school, maybe seeing, in the case of the SEAL teams, the wives of their buddies who are now downrange, who have a job to do. And that's they want to maintain one foot. They want to keep a foot in that world. And as I watched this over a period of, let's say, a year and a half or whatever it was, I realized that, hey, this is foundational. Whatever you've done up to any point in your life, it doesn't have to be the military. It can be anything you've done. Everyone's going to make a transition in life. It's not just military. There's going to be a death of a loved one. There's going to be a divorce. There's going to be a changing jobs. There's going to be a health scare. There's something is going to necessitate a transition at some point for everyone at some point along a path, probably multiple transition points. But I saw in this case, people have such a hard time because
leading men in combat, being in combat, in special operations, having your best friends to your right and left as you go into a target or a compound or whatever you're doing. It's hard to leave that behind, and you're not going to recreate that in the private sector. And I realized that, okay, I'm not going to recreate this feeling in the private sector. This is one part of my life. This is just a chapter. There are other chapters ahead. I'm going to turn the page on this. That doesn't mean you forget it. That means it's part of this foundation. And what I saw is that being a foundation, whether people realize it or not, a lot of people got stuck in that foundation, meaning it's like cement that their feet are in. And instead of building on that foundation, they are stuck in it as they're maybe trying to build something new around them. They're not using it to build up. They're building something around them and kind of scrambling. I just saw that time and time again. And as I got ready to get out, I realized, hey, how do you combat that? I don't think it's going to be an issue with me because I'm very clear on what I want to do next. I have this foundation as a reader. How do I move forward and build on this foundation? Oh, one way is to not stay here and go to the same bars and restaurants and schools as I have been for my time in the military. Let's make a physical and psychological break with the military and move somewhere else and essentially start this new life, this next chapter in a new place. And so we did that. I think also identifying what's important to you ahead of time, meaning so you don't waste time debating, thinking about possibilities as an opportunity arises. Rather, you already know the answer. Meaning, for me, freedom was the most important thing. I identified freedom as the most important thing in my life as I move on and leave the military. Okay, great. What does that mean? Okay, it means the ability to control my own schedule. It means financial freedom, more today than maybe at other times in our history. It means never having a boss. It means never having a resume. It means never having a card that I hand someone. Those things are important to me. So with those things being important to me, as I started to get out, I did get offers to do other things. I was already writing, already had this manuscript by the time I got out. I was in the editing phase of the first book when I got out, trying to make it as good as I could possibly get it before sending it to Simon & Schuster. But I still got offers. But as they came in, I thought, and I wasn't out there advocating for myself. People just wanted to introduce me to other people and wanted to help as I transitioned. But because I was pretty quiet about writing. I didn't want to have people tell me how hard it was to get something published. So I kept it super close hold in the military. And then as I got out, then I started to mention it to people. But let's say I got introduced to someone, let's say finance, Oklahoma City. Okay, so now I have this offer. Now I talk to my wife and we look at it and we say, oh, look, it hits one thing, financial freedom. What does it not hit? Oh, it doesn't hit this other thing here that's important to you, to us as a family, which is the ability to control your schedule and never having a boss again. Instant no. No other time is spent thinking about, oh, Oklahoma City, what are the schools like over there? What are houses? What would it be like if we moved? No bandwidth is now wasted on that because I already know what's important and I already know the answer. So I think you can get kind of muddled. Let's say you had 5 of those types of offers or opportunities or possibilities or whatever. And now you're tracking down 5, 6, 7 of those, and your bandwidth is on 5, 6, 7 of those offers, thinking about your family, talking to your spouse about it. And that is a whole lot of time that's not spent doing those things that are important to you or figuring out those things that are important to you that you want to do next. So I think that helps knowing those answers, so identifying what's important to you. And then also it's like, what is your mission? And for me, we have a middle child with severe special needs who needs 24/7 full-time care for life. So my mission is making sure that he is taken care of for life, that his special needs trust is funded to a place where no one ever has to worry about how he's going to be taken care of for life. And that is a very expensive proposition. That is my mission. And my passion is writing. So how do I combine those two? Okay, well, I have a mission. I have a passion. I'm combining those two to give me purpose going forward. So I think that's the triangle right there. And no one ever passed that on to me. I just thought of it. I think I thought of it off the top of my head when someone asked me about it once. But I thought, okay, my mission in life, I clearly identified that. I clearly identified my passion. What do those two things do for me? Oh, they give me purpose. going forward. Okay. So I realized it in retrospect. I didn't realize that it was actually happening at the time. I was just doing, I was just sprinting. I was just working. But that's looking back, that's what I did. And I think that's useful. So I pass those along for whatever it's worth.
I think that's a great sort of plan, if you will, because no plans actually survive, as we all know. But I think there's a great starting point there for everyone to think about it differently and think about the opportunities differently. That was wonderful. I also just want to mention there are a number of organizations that the Cipher Brief supports that also offer help with things that will help you be in a better place to do that. They help with substance abuse, they help with marriage counseling. They help with kids who are going through trauma in families. So there are a lot of great organizations. We'll put some up on our website as well that we know do a particularly good job. And you can kind of take your pick this season if people are so inclined to give to those organizations. But it's been so amazing just to spend this last hour with you and really feel like we got to know you a lot better. Really feel like we understand your creative process. I think you have a brilliant strategic mind. You're able to, in ways that not everybody is, look at opportunities and see how they converge, which to me takes everyone to the next level. So I hope everyone listening along today also understands that they have so many opportunities in their lives that they can bring together if they identify them too. But it sounds a little cheesy now. I'm sounding like a school teacher, but
No, it's fantastic. It's fantastic. I mean, I've always known from when I was how lucky I was just to be born in the United States, and just and what was sacrificed from us, probably because of my grandfather, but also through reading and being a student of history, just how much was sacrificed for us, for me as a 6-year-old, 7-year-old, 8-year-old kid, realizing that how much was sacrificed for me, so that I could have these options and opportunities, and also have to safeguard those same freedoms for future generations. That has always been very, very clear to me. So I think that just being appreciative, I've had that appreciation since I was a little kid. I try to pass that on to my kids by introducing them to World War II veterans in places like Normandy and Pearl Harbor. With the Best Defense Foundation, as a family, we volunteer with them, and having my kids, one's 19 and our youngest is 14 now, but having them be able to hear stories from people who stormed the beaches at Normandy, on the beach at Normandy. It's a little different than reading it, although reading it certainly for me as a kid gave me this appreciation. With all the distractions for kids these days, I found that having them sit down very naturally with veterans of World War II, other wars as well, Vietnam, and hear those stories from people and realize what was sacrificed for them it breaks through some of the other distractions that are out there for kids these days, the electronic distractions, and allow them to really think about what was sacrificed, and then gives them a greater appreciation for what we have in this country today.
it's a huge gift. It's really a huge gift. Dr. Carr, it's been such a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for joining us here at the Cipher Brief. And I look forward to the next story. You're going to go back to writing after this conversation and then bringing you back.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.